So a lack of funding and student debt are just some of the issues at the center of the South African student protests. Earlier this week, Higher Education Minister Dr. Nzimande said the National Student Financial Aid Scheme will have a funding shortfall for the 2021 academic year. At the height of the Fees Must Fall protest a few years ago, former President Jacob Zuma launched a commission of inquiry into higher education funding to advise him on the feasibility, at least, of free education in this country. That commission found that existing funding schemes were A, inadequate, B, unsustainable, and in fact C, free education is not feasible, and that alternative funding models should rather be considered. While Professor Daniel Bradlow made inroads in finding alternative funding models, including private-public partnership, for an idea of how this is going to look. And to tell us a bit more about his proposal on that special purpose entity, let's bring in the Prof himself, who joins us via our video link. Prof, thanks very much for your time. It's great to have you on the program. I wonder whether it's worth starting in the midst of the widespread disagreement with issues that we do agree with, and that is there is underfunding for university students in South Africa. Do you get the sense that all stakeholders at least agree on that score?
I think that's undeniable. The fact that the students who are students who are being admitted to universities and are not able to take up that place because they can't meet the registration fees, people who are graduating but can't get their degrees because they haven't paid their fees, it's proof positive that we haven't solved the problem.
Right.
And I think everybody agrees on that.
Yeah. And I want to hone in on the Fees Commission that I alluded to, released in 2017 by then President Jacob Zuma. Part of what was found, as I mentioned, is that free education is actually not feasible, at least in the current status quo. But it also introduced an ICL system, income contingent loans, if you like, which were meant to replace NSFAS. Do you have information about how that would look, and if that is still our best option at this stage?
I mean, there are many ways one could do a scheme like that. I think the starting point has to be that we recognize that students have a right to education. Anyone who gets admitted to university should be able to take up that position, and that not having money shouldn't be a barrier to being able to do that. But the second thing is that we also have to recognize that in reality there is no such thing as free education. Somebody has to pay for it, whether it's the state, whether it's the students or somebody else. And the idea of income contingent loans is saying you should have to pay when you're able to pay. So that maybe when you're admitted as a student and you don't have any income and you come from a poor family, you don't have the money to pay. But when you graduate and you start earning a good salary, if hopefully that's what happens, then you should be able to pay, and the amount you should pay should vary according to the income, so that you're not left in a poor position because you're paying off heavy debts on your university education, but that you are paying back something. So that's definitely a model that's used, for example, in Australia and is successful in some cases. There are other models one could look at. So one could look at a model, for example, like with medical students, that they pay back part of their education in effect by doing community service. So there might be a way to, at least with some forms of education, some faculties, to say people when they graduate, if they go work in community service in underserved areas for a certain period of time, can pay back their education that way. That happens sometimes with teachers, for example.
Right. And there's also the special purpose entity, which is a project I imagine you were part of. It, in part, envisages having a university, in some respects, be responsible for raising money. That money is then used to pay for students, but in the form of a loan. If I am correct, do you then agree that it doesn't go far enough in addressing the political issues around free education, which by and large has been an electioneering point for the ANC, which promised essentially free education, not loans, not some kind of payback scheme, etc.?
That's true. It doesn't address that issue. But if you take into account that these proposals were made before COVID, and if you look at Minister Mbowene's budget speech this year, for the first time, the government is cutting in real terms the budget for basic education and for health. And so if it's going to move money into something, is it really the best place to put it into university education or to put it back into basic education and health and social programs? So I think what I would be suggesting is that we need to start from the position that everybody should have the opportunity to get as much education as they can, and if they qualify for university, they should be able to go to university regardless of ability to pay, but that we need a creative funding model that brings the universities into the system, and that says also, look, if people get educated and become productive members of society, we all benefit. And so that all of us have a stake in the success of universities and university students, and so we should all contribute in some way. And the special purpose vehicle you were mentioning is a way for saying, let everybody contribute, even if it's small amounts. But those of us who've benefited from the past or have benefited from education in the past and are earning good money now should be able to put money into schemes that become self-sustaining and that provide a predictable financing for students going forwards. No students should have to suffer during their education because they can't pay, but as I said, when they're earning money, to expect them to repay, I don't think is an unreasonable thing. Or to say, look, if you don't want to do that, do some community service in your area of training. So you gain some valuable experience, which improves your job possibilities later, and pay back the society for your income, for your education in that way.
Do we have countries around the world who are doing that and getting it right?
There's certainly countries that have community service schemes. I think Nigeria, for example, has one. There are countries that have loan schemes that are linked to income, as we talked before. So, for example, Australia is an example of that. I don't know of there are examples in the US of people who can get their medical education paid, and then they have to work as doctors in underserved areas for a certain number of years in order to pay back their medical education. So there are schemes that work. This would be I would imagine to start this off, we'd have to start it off on a pilot basis to make sure that we have all the systems in place and that it works efficiently. But it seems to me it's an option. It seems to me we don't have a choice other than to choose creative, innovative ways of financing education. The universities don't have the money, the government doesn't have the money to give free education without any repayment. And the only way it can do that is to take money from something else. And it doesn't seem to me justified to take money from education, health, social services. And if there is money to go into something, they have at least as good a claim as higher education on the need for more money.
Prof, of course there are two sides to this coin, isn't it? A, we could try find money to try service the debt that comes from student fees, or we can just make going to university more affordable. If we are to focus on the latter, would taking on a model like what UNISA is doing become a viable option, do you think? The idea of just making as much of the curriculum as possible virtual and hopefully cutting into some of the overhead costs that it takes to run a university institution, a cost which is likely going to be passed down to students in the form of fees.
I don't think we should see them as mutually exclusive options. I think we should be doing both, and that the universities need to think creatively, how do we deliver education in the cheapest way, in the most effective way. It's important to remember that the virtual learning model assumes students have access to reliable internet, that they have electricity, and that they're able to learn. And so the universities have to at least take that into account and compensate in cases where that's necessary. But I agree with you, the universities should not be let off the hook and should have to be as efficient and as they can possibly be, and to keep costs as low as possible. But there is a certain level of costs that are inevitable with the university. I mean, I know I'm an academic, so I have a special affection for universities, but universities play a very important role, not only in terms of educating the next generation of doctors, lawyers, engineers, etc., but also in producing new knowledge for the society, helping to solve social problems in the society. They employ large numbers of people. So to keep them running as well as we possibly can is an important goal, as well as providing a good education and doing that at a good cost.
Very quickly, Prof, it almost feels to me that a lot of thinking has gone into ways through which we can find sustainable ways of providing some semblance of free education. What should the higher education department do from here on? Go back to what we have already at our disposal, or still continue trying to carve out more creative solutions, so to speak?
I think they have to, I don't think they should drop things until we know we have something better, because NSFAS might not be great, but it does serve a purpose. But I think there is no choice other than to look at creative new ways of doing this that allow the government to play a role, but that also bring in other stakeholders and say we all have to contribute to solving this problem.
Professor Daniel Bradlow, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate your insights on this issue. The Prof there is part of University of Pretoria, is my understanding, and certainly amongst the many other academics who've tried to contribute to ways through which we can carve out a funding model that will make free education in our country somewhat possible. I wonder how you see things. Tweet us at Newzroom 405.